gentlemen. This is the first time I've had the opportunity to introduce Acting President Tim Sands.
Hello. I think I've met almost everyone.
We can do that pretty quick too, but I also want to say on my right, Morgan Burke is the Athletic Director for Purdue University. On my left is Elisa Rollick, who's the Vice President for Compliance. Ethics and Compliance, my apologies. Tell you what, why don't we just start with Mike and kind of let these folks know who you are.
Mike Lowitz, WBAA.
Tara Sipples, the exponent.
Brock Smith, exponent.
Rob Albenar, Drum Courier.
Eric Whittle, the Drum Courier.
Brian Pelosi, the Purdue University News Service.
Sean Murphy, Fox 59.
I'm Stacey Clarity with Gold and Black.
Before you start, Tim, there's one reporter that was making his way back in here. He's with Fox. He's here.
They meet twice a year. They look at governance, the Iowa athletics.
Okay.
Just opening remarks, so if you'd like to start.
All right. Well, you know, we're all here, I'm sure, you would like to talk about specifics, but we need to remember that this was all driven by our obligation to protect the most vulnerable among us, the children involved. I'll open it up to questions, but I've got support here from Elisa Rollick. You heard Vice President for Ethics and Compliance, and Morgan Burke, our Athletic Director, who can talk a little bit about Purdue's activities relevant to the topic today. So I'll leave it open to questions.
So right now, is there any type of review going on at the university level to kind of see what kind of ethics or compliance issues are currently being used and what can be done from the results of the peer report on Penn State? How is that being?
Well, you heard, I'll turn it over to Elisa to maybe give some specifics, but you heard at the board meeting last Friday that the chair of the board and I made a comment, I think, to that effect, that we're taking this seriously and we're using the enterprise risk management process that we've been working on for the last year or more as a vehicle in order to address the recommendations of the three reports, see what we can do at Purdue to enhance our the clarity of our activities in this regard, and to make sure that we're that we have a balance of power, if you will, that is appropriate for a university. But I'll turn it over to Elisa to maybe talk about some specifics.
Well, certainly.
Could you turn the microphone toward me? Thank you.
As President Sands indicated, we will be looking at each of the recommendations of the free report. I've read the report, and a number of the leadership of the university have read the report, and we've reviewed the recommendations that certainly were made in the context of Penn State. And so what we will be doing is to look at each of those recommendations and those areas of recommendation to see to what extent they are applicable to Purdue and ways in which we can improve what we do. When the arrest and indictment of Mr. Sandusky first occurred, the president called together the senior leadership of the university, and we discussed what we are currently doing to, in particular to protect children, and looking at areas where we felt we had some gaps that we perhaps needed to improve our processes. And so we did a number of things, one of which was to develop and implement an online training on harassment that includes in particular responses to suspected child sexual abuse and neglect. And so that's been in place since March of this year, and a number of folks have gone through that. For those who didn't have access to computer training, for example, a number of our folks in physical facilities. So we've trained more than 200 staff in physical facilities who had previously been trained, but added, obviously, an additional emphasis on child sexual abuse and neglect. We looked at all aspects of our employees. We already had background check policy for our new hires, but we said, well, let's look at volunteers. And so we recently put into effect effective July 1, a policy requiring the registration and violent and sex offender registry checks at minimum for all volunteers within the Purdue University system. And so that process is underway now as people are, certainly for new volunteers, and currently doing those checks on existing volunteers. Recently, the business services area of the university has included, they will be including in future procurement contracts, agreements from those vendors who do business with the university and who provide their staff on our campus. So typically, we're talking about some construction site or anyone else who may bring their people onto our campuses, that they would agree as well to do checks on those individuals before permitting them to come to our campus. So those are just a few things.
We instituted a couple things this summer under, at least under that umbrella. One was all of the summer camp activity. So it was an outside teacher or even our existing staff, student athletes, went through 2 background checks as we were looking at that whole process. And the second thing actually predates this whole circumstance by well over a year, but as we were completing Mackey, we did a look at the use of our facilities and put in a process in place that said it's for student athletes and staff only, and you know, it's not a health club for the community. So we buttoned that down in May of last year. Really more of a liability issue than precursor to Penn State, but something we need to do.
Is the athletics department under any additional pressure because of this? Just because so much of this happened at Penn State was happening on athletics, it was associated with football. I mean, does Purdue Athletics feel an extra, I guess, responsibility?
Yeah, I think we have a responsibility to safeguard the 500 student athletes or the hundreds of thousands of people who come to our venues each year. And you know, I think that it does create the linkage because we did have some athletic overtones, but this is really a broader set of issues and could happen in a lot of different places. I mean, we have you know, hundreds of young people who come through this campus that aren't Purdue students during the course of the year. We want to make sure those kids all have a great experience and leave in a better position than when they came.
Can you talk more about the Whistleblower Hotline, how it works, and what the was that in response to the Penn State case as well?
No, it was not. We've had a whistleblower hotline for a number of years, and largely implemented as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley, which of course does not apply to universities, but in an attempt to, and that involves financial dealings, but in an attempt to provide a vehicle for reporting suspected fraud, abuse, or any other wrongdoing. We established a hotline. We have since engaged a third-party vendor who operates the hotline for us. It is accessible by a website or by a telephone. Nowadays people tend to email. And so any suspected wrongdoing of any sort can be reported anonymously through that system. You can also get a unique identifier known only to the third-party vendor and the individual. They still don't have to disclose their identity. And so they can check back to see the results, perhaps. And if we, the institution, have questions that person might be able to help us with, we can communicate with the third-party vendor. They can post that question, and the person can come in. So no, we've had the whistleblower system in place, and in this situation, you can imagine that that if the custodians who had been aware, who were aware of wrongdoing, had knowledge of the existence of a hotline where they could have perhaps reported it anonymously, that might have been beneficial to them. So we want to have multiple avenues for people to report what wrongdoing or abuse they may believe to present.
The background checks work when somebody's been caught before.
Absolutely.
So is the online training to identify mandatory, or how does that sort of fill in the gap?
Well, right now, so if someone is determined to commit a criminal act, training and background, it's not going to prevent it. But what we're hoping that is that those who might observe it are educated and are able to take action should something happen. At present, the training is not mandatory. We are in the early stages of the online training and getting feedback on that, and then we anticipate that in the next few months or so, we would have a decision about whether or not that training would be made mandatory.
Given what we learned through the free report, could one of you just, I guess, react or give a reaction to what you thought of what President Emmert laid forth today? What was the reaction to the sanctions against Penn State today?
I would say that we're going to refer to the letter that President Sands worked on with the Council on Presidents and Chancellors in the Big Ten, which basically, upholds the sanctions and then adds some of their own.
Yeah, Penn State did accept factual findings of the free report.
In terms of this letter, it talks about how, one of the issues is the consequence, that they think that one of the issues that let this happen at Penn State was a successful athletic program had all this power. I mean, how at Purdue, what are you doing to make sure that doesn't happen here, or that, whether it's...
First of all, we'll go through with the activities that Dr. Sands and Dr. Rollick mentioned. If you go to Chapter 10, we're 5.0, and there's a series of recommendations, and we have a responsibility to provide some input by, I think, September the 4th, back to that process. Eric, I don't think you can legislate people's values. You try when you hire people to set the right tone. We've always said that integrity is kind of the watchword for who we are at Purdue. I think short of that, we've tried to make sure through annual performance planning that those values continue to get lots of sunshine. And I think that probably the best safeguard you had is that all of our business processes are intertwined in the university. So whether it be the management of gift funds, procurement practices, capital construction, all university HR policies are something that we're another unit within the institution, and we take our responsibility just like any other unit to follow the letter of the policies. I would tell you that I think you can go back well before I got to Purdue and look at how those processes were embedded. For example, our senior business officer also reports to the Vice President of Business Services, and most of my direct reports have connections functionally to other people on campus. So our organization was set up to mirror the institutions, and I think that's served as a reasonable check and balance. It's not an absolute guarantee, but a reasonable check and balance.
I think of it as a kind of like where we heard the term of a Venn diagram, that the football program needs to exist within the athletic program in terms of policies and procedures. And the athletic program needs to exist within the university entirely in terms of policies and procedures. And that's the way we think about it, and we try to make sure that we stick to that.
If I could add, in my role, I'm also the Title IX officer for the university, and so my reporting line is to the president, and that's obviously outside of collegiate athletics. We have a deputy Title IX officer within, coordinator within collegiate athletics. We have a circulation of police reports that includes me as the Title IX officer, also includes student affairs where relevant, and so there are multiple checks and areas of responsibility such that no one unit is isolated. Morgan's a little humble, but he certainly has taken the lead in intercollegiate athletics to require training of his staff and regular training and updates on university policies. And so they're certainly not isolated from the rest of the university.
President Sands, in terms of this letter, so this is something that you were involved in writing with the other presidents of the Big Ten. I mean, was there a lot of agreement on what you decided to do for this council? Was there any discussion or disagreements about things that they already received enough from this morning's announcement?
Well, I should give you a little perspective. Those discussions started in November of 2011.
Okay. So
France Cordova, our previous president, was engaged in those discussions through the last several months, and I picked up at the very end because my term started just a few days ago. But there were active engagement discussions. Everybody was involved. We had a president and chancellor for each of the Big Ten campuses in those discussions. Obviously, Penn State's president was not involved in the discussions regarding the sanctions, but it was a very vigorous and active discussion. It was really focused on making sure that the sanctions were aligned with the NCAA's statement. We all support the actions of the NCAA, and that we didn't harm, to the extent possible, the innocents involved in this whole activity and incident. We followed the same principles, really, that the NCAA board followed in designing their sanctions.
Aside from the sanctions and the action taken by the NCAA, what about just reaction to the Penn State case itself, just the human reaction to this whole situation?
Well, I think everybody has a very similar reaction from what I've been able to see. Again, your thoughts immediately go to the children, the young individuals who are the real victims. Beyond that, one has to look at the university. It's a great university. Penn State is still a great university. It's got a great academic tradition. Whatever we do here we need to make sure that we do not damage the university going forward. But clearly, I think people's emotions are all over the gamut. I think everybody is focused, though, still on the victims. We haven't heard the end of that, and they're not out of our minds. They will be on our minds for years to come.
Did the athletic department have any specific contingency plans in place had Penn State received the death penalty, such as the tickets for that game or scheduling?
No.
Because you didn't think it was going to happen?
No, it's not an easy contingency. I mean, you got to line up. All the opponents are selected. So, I mean, I think if that would have occurred, we have a meeting this week in Chicago, we would have talked about it. I think there's approaches that could have been used. But I think that President Emmert was very careful in choosing his words about crafting a set of penalties that would move towards the culture and yet would have a punitive aspect, would try to do minimal harm to the innocent bystanders. And in the broadcast, he specifically talked about people like the band, current student athletes, people who might work in and around State College, whose livelihood is affected by this. So I think the presidents, it sounded like they really struggled with how to craft that message. And try to minimize the impact on the innocent bystanders.
And what kind of impact do you foresee on athletics here, just because Penn State won't be taking part in the Big Ten games?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the Purdue culture is one that is a respectful culture. And I think that when Penn State comes to play us, I think it's November 3rd, I think our Purdue people and our students are wise enough to realize that the young men that are playing in that game had nothing to do with this situation, and that really no useful purpose is going to be served by pulling those kids into it. And I think that again, that's one of the aspects of the Purdue culture that I really respect, is that it is a culture that does respect people, and very rarely when people come into our venues, there may be some good-natured chiding, but you don't see much vindictiveness in our fan base, and I think our people will rise up and realize that these young people are not part of it.
I'm going to need to bring this to a close, so this might be the last question.
Well, I guess I was more referring to also in terms of the money and the revenue shares in the conference. I mean, do you foresee that?
I think they dealt with that. I think the Big Ten and the council presidents have agreed that the money that would have been theirs as part of the revenue sharing relative to bowl games will be put into a fund that will be used to deal with this kind of situation, the abuse in each of the Big Ten communities, and details on how they're going to do that I'm not sure of. But I think they've tried to make sure at the same time, I don't think they wanted to have any of the sports. I think Penn State sponsors 28 sports. I don't think they're eager to see any of they probably have close to 900 student athletes. I don't think they want to see any of those kids that are there now to be affected. So I think as they tried to craft the penalty, and I think Penn State deserves a lot of credit for stepping forward and basically being as open as they have been on this. I think they're trying to do the right thing, and these are hard and very sobering experiences.
Well, thank you for coming. Appreciate the time.